Hello everyone, DonTheCrown here, and today is the 7th day of the Weaver of Destiny event here on Torchlight Infinite Arcana season, which means if you've been logging in 7 days from January 9th through February 8th, you have the opportunity now to claim a legendary Battle Pact Spirit Selection Pack. This gives you the option to pick a legendary Pact Spirit from this giant list of options, which is probably a little bit overwhelming because you get to pick whichever one you want. You can scroll down here and there's even more options. And so this is really cool because normally when you get a legendary Pact Spirit, it's just completely random, or you're pulling on a specific banner and hoping to get the best one for your particular build. But in this particular case, you're able to pick almost all of the Battle Pact Spirits except for the one that gives you max channel stacks from last season. But in this video, we're going to go through and break down what I think are the best ones. Now, in typical content creator fashion, we've gone through and made a tier list. So let's just talk about them real quick. And the different ratings or rankings for these are best at role, which means that they're the best at their particular job. Flexible means that these are ones that are probably either pretty close to being equal to the one that's at the best at the role, like very, very close, or is just usable in a lot more different builds, which I think is good. Good ones are ones that are, pretty solid to pick. And then bad ones are not bad per se. However, they are probably bad to pick from this particular box, because whatever you're looking for from these guys, probably something better from the ones up top. So starting off here with Anthem, Knight of Pale Blue, and Preserver of Eternity. These are all about helping you level up and getting you XP up to level 100. So Anthem here is pretty important because what she gives you are these nodes right here, where you get up to 40% XP fall off caused between the level difference between the player and the map. As you level up, the amount of XP you're getting from maps or zones that are lower level than you decreases by quite a bit. And what this helps you do is get that experience back. And so by having this pet and the purple version of it, where you have 80% XP fall off kind of restored to you, gives you a massive difference in leveling speed, like significantly, like big multiplier, like 4 times almost. And so Anthem is probably the best pet if you're looking to go to level 100. Now, the other pet, number 2, I would say for that, is going to be Knight of Pale Blue. And Knight of Pale Blue is very solid because he gives you XP earned, which is just a big multiplier, 12% more XP, very, very solid as well. But he is also a very defensive pet in that he gives you resistances, less damage taken, and then less physical damage taken when there's only one enemy nearby, so like an elite or a boss, and less damage taken on top of that as well. So this is a very solid option. His little brother, I would say, is Spirit Bless, which we have down a couple tiers. The reason why he's not up higher is because he's a little bit more conditional in that he just gives you max energy shield, mana regen, or more energy shield charge. So I don't feel like this is as good as Pale Blue. Now, the last one in the top 3 survival ones is Preserver of Eternity. And she makes it so that you actually lose less XP on death. And so if you're like really scared of dying or whatever, you're doing some sort of content where you're almost sure that you're going to die, you can use Preserver of Eternity to save some of that XP, just make it a little bit safer. I do know there's some people who, instead of doing like more XP gains, they'll just go for less XP loss, just so they can be sure that they will eventually get all the way up there, especially because at level 99, you cannot kind of save your XP by spending tokens, which can be a little painful. So she gives you elemental resistance, chance to avoid damage, and then up to 40% less XP loss on death. And then this one is pretty nice, especially for leveling. Is 30% movement speed if you haven't been hit recently, and then just more movement speed on top of that, which is just really, really great. Now, next on our tier list here, we're going to be getting into some of the actual damage dealing pets. And all of these up here, I believe, are really good for what they do. But first, let's talk about Abyssal King Soul. So Abyssal King Soul got I think the first place positioning just because for Affliction and Reaping builds, he is just absolutely ridiculous. First off, you get Reaping cooldown recovery speed, which is kind of like a multiplier for the build. You get dot damage, which isn't bad. And then you get 40% affliction effect, which is like the equivalent of 40% more damage. And then you also get a chance for dots to spread, and then 25% additional Reaping cooldown recovery speed, which is like one of the most sought after stats for a Reaping build. And so it's just absolutely huge. Just 25% more Reaping damage, basically, which is 25% more damage. And this guy is just probably the most strong out of all of them. The next one I want to talk about here is Fog Scorpion. So I'm sure that especially the people that are playing Greyhand right now are going to be asking, like, which one's better, Fog Scorpion or Red Umbrella? Well, I think the Fog Scorpion beats Red Umbrella, and this is why. So he gives double damage to attacks here, which I think are just absolutely insane. This is 8% basically multiplicative damage, which is nice. Attack damage isn't bad, but then multi-strike is kind of bad, but using the Destiny system, we can replace these nodes no problem. But then fallback here gives you additional attack damage or attack speed when there's only one enemy nearby. So it's like against bosses, tough elites, the training dummy, and then you get additional movement speed when there's several enemies nearby. So more movement speed when you kind of want movement speed, and then more damage when you want damage is just very solid. Conversely, if we look at Red Umbrella, she has damage and then crit strike rating, which is good, and attack speed, which is good, but then her major node is kind of where she falls off. 19% chance for attacks to inflict paralysis is not that hot, in my opinion. It's a lot easier to get paralysis than it probably was when the game first came out and she had this node. And so, like, for example, on my aura, I think I have 30% chance to inflict paralysis. And so I definitely don't gain anything from that. And then I get 10% additional attack damage to enemies, damage dealt to nearby enemies, which are pretty darn close. But, you know, if you're playing melee, this is probably always going to be up. But only 10% damage versus 20% attack speed against single targets. I definitely think Fog Scorpion is winning this one. Now, back to the tier list. Dreamweaver is what I'm going to say is probably going to be the best in class for spell builds that are not going to be reaping. So Dreamweaver and Starcatcher, I think that both these guys are very solid. Dreamweaver, I think, just barely pulls ahead because some of his nodes are just really good. So we have elemental damage, we have penetration, which is a multiplier as well. Cast speed is really solid. And then we have additional elemental damage dealt by spell skills, and then more penetration as well. Just like damage everywhere, which is pretty nice. And none of this is really conditional, except for the fact that you have to be doing elemental damage. Conversely, his little brother here, Starcatcher, we have double damage for spells, which is really solid. Spell damage, cast speed, and then malleable makes it so you additional cast speed per second when an elite is nearby, up to 18%. And then you get movement speed while an elite is nearby, up to 9%. And so I think this is also very solid. And this is why on the tier list here, Starcatcher went to like the top of flexible here, because you can get a lot of spell builds that will actually be very beneficial here. However, I do believe that Dreamweaver probably pulls ahead on like just raw DPS overall. But realistically, these guys probably like should just share rank 1 together for spell-based builds. Now, next up, Drapion Lady and Scale of Original Scale of Original Sin. These two are kind of like boosting minions up really in a big way, especially Spirit Maguses, which are kind of in the spotlight right now. And Scale of Original Sin, while being very good for ultimate damage, is not going to be very good comparatively for other builds that are not Iris 2 that want to use Spirit Maguses. So Drapion Lady gives us Origin of Spirit Magus effect, which can be a big multiplier. Can also give us cooldown, which is very, very solid for more multiplier here. Minion life is kind of not that great. And then 40% Origin of Spirit Magus effect and 5% Spirit Magus skill damage is a lot. That is a rather big multiplier, which is very nice. Now for Scale of the Original Sin, he also has minion damage. He has skill effect duration, which is nice. And then sealed mana compensation for Spirit Magus skills. And so if you're playing like multiple Spirit Maguses, this is pretty appealing to get 40%, less mana consumed by your Magus. And then Scale of Judgment is kind of nuts if you're playing Iris 2. So 40% additional Spirit Magus ultimate damage when Strength, Dex, and Spirit Intelligence are equal. So all you have to do is just buff Intelligence. And if your Strength and Dexterity are both 0, you're pretty much good to go. You don't really need to finagle with this too much. But there are you can balance them out as well. But for Iris 2, this is probably the best in slot. Now, moving down into the flexible part of the tree here, Poison Omen, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people that comment on the video that say Poison Omen should be number 1, she's the best. But what she does is basically gives us the ability to go and add 1 additional curse, which I think, while being rather strong, is not as strong as a lot of people would like to make you believe. So as additional damage, less damage taken from cursed enemies, curse effect, but just 6%. And then poison drinking makes it so that you can cast 1 more curse, so you can have 2 if this is your only source. And normally you would get this on a candle, and then get movement speed if you have cast a curse recently. Now the problem with this is if we actually go and we look at the curses, we can kind of break them down into a couple different sections. So we have the elemental curses here, which all benefit for elemental stuff. We have physical curse with vulnerability, and then we have erosion curse, and then we have damage over time here with frost touch and entangled pain, and then blind kind of doesn't really do much. And what this means is that physical, if you're doing a physical based build, you can really only use 1 curse. There's nothing else for you. You're pretty much going to be using vulnerability, and that's it. If you're playing an elemental damage build, you're probably going to do cold and elemental destruction, or electrocute, elemental destruction, or scorch and elemental destruction. So you're just going to be picking between those 2. Erosion builds only going to be picking corruption, because elemental destruction does not help you out. And then dot based builds are going to use frost touch, entangled pain, and probably any of these basic. So dot based builds are going to use 2 to 3. So if you do a physical dot, you're going to do vulnerable, entangled pain. If you're doing a fire build, you could do scorch, elemental destruction, entangled pain. If you're doing an erosion build, you're doing corruption, frost touch, and entangled pain. So up to 3. So if you're playing a dot based build, then yes, having 1 more curse is really nice, but it's not as impactful for as many builds out there. And I don't think that this is going to help you as much as having just another multiplier in this same spot is not super duper impactful for you. And also, you can't just slap this on a low gear character. You do need to have some way to apply that curse. And so if you're replacing 1 damage skill with another damage skill, you're not really gaining anything. And so you need to have high-end gear that automatically curses enemies for you in order to make this kind of work. Otherwise, it's not very good. Now, next up, we have backup power, which I remember when this guy came out, I kind of thought he was a little bit of a joke. But looking at him again, I think he's kind of ridiculous. So he has attack and cast speed, which is just very solid all the way around. Lightning damage is a little bit less appealing. But he has movement speed, which makes him an insane leveling pet for sure. And you can also always replace these nodes with destinies now. It's not a big deal if you don't want movement speed later on. But then he gives you 35% numbed effect. And what numb does is you have up to 10 stacks of it, and each stack of numb increases the damage taken by additional 4%. And so if we take 40% damage here times 3.5, that's a 14% multiplier. However, if you're going to be working with numbed, you're probably going to take the passive that makes it so that numbed gives you 10% damage per. So this ends up being a 35% just more damage multiplier when you have 10 stacks of numbed up, which is just really ridiculously good. And there's a lot of builds that can probably work in getting numbed into their build that could potentially take a lot of advantage of this. And so it's not just a lightning build per se that would be good with this. Next up, we have Iron Lion, who is a Bob Marley reference, I believe. And this is maybe kind of okay in some ways. It has knockback distance, projectile speed, which can turn into multiplicative damage if you're using an amulet, projectile damage, but then having +2 projectiles, I think has a lot of potential where you can make this very, very strong, probably more powerful than some of the other options we've had so far, but that it kind of is very flexible for each build. So some builds are going to want more projectiles, some builds probably won't care at all. And so this is really just something that maybe could be really good or could almost even like fall down into bad. Now, we talked about Red Umbrella here a little bit. We talked about Spirit Bless. So let's hop in. Let's talk about Mechanical Throne. So Mechanical Throne is a synthetic troop pack spirit here. And this guy is all pretty much going to be for Moto enjoyers. So it gives you minion damage, minion attack and cast speed, minion health, and then chance for synthetic troop minions to deal double damage. So it's like 14% more multiplier here, basically. And then they get more attack and cast speed when they do double damage. And so this can probably stay up most of the time, assuming you have a lot of minions hitting. So I think this guy is pretty okay for sure. Next up, let's talk about Fire Swordsman. So Fire Swordsman, if you are trying to compare this guy to Abyssal Soul King, he's still pretty good, but he's going to kind of fall behind here. Now, he does also give you dot damage. He gives you a chance to apply ailments, which is probably not super great, but he also does have the affliction effect, which is a big multiplier. And then he has reaps 0.8 seconds of dot damage when inflicting ailments. And this effect has a 6-second cooldown against the same target. And so reap builds tend to want to put as many like sources of reap into the build as possible. So this is a good thing to have. And having more reap duration for each reap dealt is also very good. This guy definitely is not as good as his buddy, the Abyssal King Soul, because, you know, just having 25% more reap is just going to be better. Next up, Firewing here is another damage over time pet. Has dot damage, it has skill effect duration, which I think is pretty good. Also has the affliction effect, so we're seeing a lot of commonality between these. And then its ultimate here is very strong, except it is also very limiting. So it gives you 80% affliction effect at full life, and then applies more affliction per second, which doesn't really matter all that much. However, you don't really get this benefit unless you are playing a full life build. A lot of times affliction based builds will be going energy shield as well, and they will like to reserve an aura on their life. So you can't do that and use this with this pet, which is the main reason this is not like ranked a lot higher. This is still a very good pet if you are, you know, not at the point yet where you can put auras on your life. However, probably not a super duper end game one. Next up, we have Crossroad Walker. And Crossroad Walker is another damage over time guy. So we have a chance to inflict ailments, we have ailment damage, and then we have ailment duration. So he does not have the affliction effect like his compatriots, but ailment duration is also kind of a multiplier here, just because, you know, that is something that, you know, there's going to be more of the ailment kind of built up there. And we do get additional ailment damage caused against cursed enemies and curse effect. We forgot to mention curse effect before, but like 11% curse effect is probably going to be close to 4% multiplicative damage. So this guy really isn't all that bad either. Still not as good as Abyssal Soul or King Soul, but yeah, still pretty darn good. Next up, let's talk about Whisperwind Leaves. She is down here. And this is about recently summoned minions. And so we have minion damage, minion attack and cast speed, minion life, and then additional damage for recently summoned minions and critical strike rating for recently summoned minions. And I would assume if you're playing Moto 2 that this is probably your best in slot pet, because I think you are constantly blowing up your pets or your minions and stuff to, you know, resummon them and blow them up again. However, Moto 2's kind of been like out of the limelight for a couple of patches now, so not really sure how good this would actually be. So I don't know if I can really recommend picking this unless you're already playing that build, and then you probably know better for that. Lastly, for the good section here, we do have Flower Whisperer, and this is the like attack projectile pet. And we get projectile damage, projectile speed, and then attack critical strike rating, which is okay. But then on the major node here, I think that these are rather limiting and also not very good. So you get 16% additional projectile skill critical strike damage against distant enemies. And I think that is great. Like, this is actually a huge multiplier, very, very solid. If you're playing a projectile build that crits a lot, like almost 100% crit, this is probably even better than Fog at some points. Maybe actually not as good as Fog, because you would want to actually, you probably always have enemies that are close, and getting enemies that are distant is probably going to be difficult as well. But then plus 40% attack projectile skill critical strike rating is very low. That is like, this is almost a non-existent line, which does kind of suck. Now, let's talk about the ones that I kind of think are bad. Starting off here with the best of the worst, which is Warbler of Plum Blossoms. Now, Warbler of Plum Blossoms is a survival pet. It does give you XP bonuses, which is really good. However, if you're comparing like her elemental resistance and mana regen to taking less damage from our friend Knight of Pale Blue, she's going to really pale in comparison to Pale Blue. And then her major node here just gives you more resistance, and then just 2% of physical damage is converted to random element. And I don't think that that is very solid at all, which is why I think that if you want a pet that gives you bonus XP, you should just pick Pale Blue instead of the Warbler of Plum Blossoms. Next up, we have Raging Sands of Eternal Night. And so Raging Sands of Eternal Night, when he first came out, I felt like it was a little bit overtuned, but now with the new balance to the game, I don't think it's very good at all. He has additional damage, he has attack block and spell block, but it's really quite easy to get attack and spell block on your hero memories and to get a lot of it. Very easy to kind of cap this out there. So these aren't all that great. And then he has attacks eliminate enemies if they are 15% life or lower if you have blocked recently. So it is conditional, and also if you want to get Culling Strike against enemies that are 15% life, you can also equip a legendary that has this exact same thing. It's called Howling Wind. If you corrupt it up, it gives you 15% elimination. However, you don't have to do anything special, you just have to hit them. And so that's typically what you would bring into like Supreme Showdown 20 in order to like finish off the enemies in time. And just having a pet where you have to get hit and then block and then you can eliminate just seems pretty bad, and seems like the type of thing that you wouldn't want to have active all of the time, which is why you don't want to pick it. Next up, we have the Witch Antelope of Lust. She gives you a little bit of damage. She gives you erosion resistance, which is not bad. Crowd control effects, and this means that things like frostbite, freeze, paralysis, knockback, weaken, slow, taunt, and blinding. I could see this being okay if you're doing some sort of support style build, but then you have Bewitched, which inflicts paralysis or weaken on enemies within 10 meters and has a cooldown of 5 seconds. And like we said before, you can inflict paralysis a whole bunch of ways. Weaken, there's a lot of ways to inflict as well. So in a lot of ways, she's like a worse red umbrella. So I can't really recommend this one. And then the final two, we probably have the cutest of all of the Battle Pack spirits with the most ridiculous name, Captain Kitty of the Furious Seas. Hiya! And if you're going for cute factor, I think that this is probably going to be the #1 pack spirit. However, this guy is all about Warcry, and Warcries for the most part are not super duper great right now. You get Warcry skill effect duration, you get cooldown, you get Warcry effect, and then you will always instantly cast Warcry, so you don't need any automation on it, and gives you more Warcry effect. However, I don't really see very many builds stacking multiple Warcries, or even like really using Warcries except for like as recovery. And the one recovery Warcry doesn't actually scale with Warcry effects. So we go to Resurrection Warcry, cast a skill and gain restoration 860 life within 4 seconds. This effect is not affected by Warcry effects, and you can get like 2% less damage taken per enemy that's nearby when you Warcry. You can probably make that to be like minimum 5, so So like 10% less damage plus all the other stuff could potentially be okay. However, you're probably just better off using other skills, which kind of makes the Pact Spirit not all that great. And then last, and I would consider least, we have the Boneworm's Daughter. And Boneworm's Daughter actually pulled this last season, and at first I was pretty excited, but I think it just has to be the worst Pact Spirit right now. Gives you mana regen, which is okay, spell damage, which is okay, critical strike damage, which is okay. We get 40% critical strike damage from here, but then her big node gives us 50 critical strike rating per ailment on enemies, up to 100. So we have to apply 2 ailments to get 100 flat rating, and then 6% critical strike damage per ailment, up to 12. This is just seemingly undertuned compared to most other pets, because that's not really a lot of damage. If this was like 6% additional critical strike damage per ailment, per up to 12, that might be pretty good, but just being flat is pretty horrible, especially in circumstances where you can get like up to 500% critical strike damage. This is like a drop in the proverbial sea, and so I'm just gonna say that she is rather bad, which means at the end of the day, what should you pick? So if you are looking to level up to 100, you don't really like play the same build every season, Anthem is always a very solid pick. However, you're probably going to end up using other pets a lot more frequently. So I would just pick a pet that is very good for the build that you're playing right now. Probably one of the ones in this lineup here if you do not already have them, or pick one of these flexible ones if you think this would be good for your build. And I know a lot of people will say Poison Omen is the best. Poison Omen is the best. This is going back for a lot of builds. If you're doing physical or erosion, you can only use 1 curse. Elemental builds generally are using 2 curses, and then you still need to get that curse from somewhere. So just putting it on your bar doesn't actually give you a damage multiplier. And then damage over time builds, I think that is actually pretty good, because you get 2 to 3 curses that help you out, and you can automate several of those. And then all of the rest of these are pretty good as well, like Red Umbrella, Flower Whisper and stuff. And yeah, so I'm probably going to be picking something soon. I already have Fog Scorpion. I'm actually not 100% sold yet on Red Umbrella for my particular setup, because I believe that, well, it's just not going to do as much damage as what I already have. So I'm using Fog Scorpion, Traveling Lizard Green Leaf, and a Woo. And so if I look at a Woo, who would be who I'd be replacing here, just go into the Pact page. Pretty much I'm already blocking out a lot of nodes with stats. So we have the exact same attack speed, the exact same damage here. But then we're looking at the big node here and get 7% additional damage, another 3% additional damage to nearby, and then 4% additional damage on top of that. And if I compare that to going and getting Red Umbrella would practically just give me 10% additional damage. And so I'm pretty sure that my Woo at blue is better, because 7%, 3 and 4. So 107 times 103 times 104. I can't do math. 107 times 1.3 times 1.4 is 14% multiplier. So I just think I'm going to stick with a Woo for now. Maybe we'd level up Fog Scorpion. Maybe we'll pick something else. I'm not really sure, but hopefully this video has helped you out, especially if you haven't already gotten any legendary Pact Spirits. But also make sure you go and you look at the Pact Spirits you already have and try to compare them as well. Like I said, like my blue level 6 of Woo seems to be pretty darn strong. Hope you guys have a good one. We'll see you again soon. Come by the stream.